Welcome back to the MSSR 2020 lecture hall, Professor George Breslauer of UC Berkeley. He will be giving us a presentation today entitled An Intellectual History of Sovietology. And as we fellows have been hearing, as you fellows, and all of us who have been on the calls for the past few weeks have been hearing, there is a dearth of Sovietologists, and we're very happy or Sovietologists as they used to be called, or Russia specialists as they're called today. So we're very happy to be talking about the history, the intellectual history of that phenomenon with one of the utmost Sovietologists that we have here with us today, Dr. Breslauer. Tomorrow, at the same time, we will be talking about the similarities and differences among the communist states over time. And then on Wednesday, we will be discussing communist states, their relationship with each other and their relationship with the United States with Professor Breslauer. So this is the first of a series of 3 lectures over the next 3 days with Professor Breslauer. And with that, I will pass the virtual microphone over to him over in California. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jarlath. Welcome. It's good to be talking to you again. I thought today's topic I might focus on the history of Sovietology, but not in order to give you all kinds of detail about the progression over time, so much as to give you an overview of a number of big issues within Sovietology and how they were handled at different points in time, and what lessons you can derive from that experience for thinking about your own future, both as writers of doctoral dissertations and as prospective entrants into the job market, whatever kind of job market you may choose to enter. So that's my purpose today. And so let me get started. I mean, by Sovietology, I basically mean the study of Soviet politics, economics, and society from afar, from a distance. Of course, it had to be from a distance during the entire Soviet period to a greater and lesser extent because of Soviet censorship and Soviet efforts to prevent Western scholars from seeing the downside, you might say, of Soviet economics and society and penetrating the study of Soviet politics. So it had to be done from a distance, but thousands of people were intrigued by this subject matter and went into it as a professional area of either study or interaction. It started really, I mean, there were always Russia specialists in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but it really got off the ground during World War II. But not within university settings. It was more within governmental and non-governmental settings where they stockpiled specialists on the Soviet Union to gain their expertise, learn from them about how we should think about the Soviet Union. But what happened after World War II and the onset of the Cold War in approximately 1947 was that it suddenly became a national security imperative. And what happened then was a combination of US governmental funding by independent foundations, and funding by universities led to the establishment of centers for research on the Soviet Union or on just Russia, first at Columbia University, then at Harvard University, and at UC Berkeley. And those were the first 3 in 1948. This evolved over time. There was an enormous amount of money put in by the foundations and the government and by the host universities to make these centers into major centers of research. What happened, though, in the late 1950s, a decade later, was that the startling effect of the Soviet success in putting Sputnik into orbit around the Earth, and earlier, a few months before that, in launching an intercontinental ballistic missile. neither of which had been done by the United States as yet, there emerged a national security fear that we had to catch up, that in some sense the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States. And so massive new funding and additional funding, both by foundations and by the US government, went into founding centers for research on the Soviet Union at many different universities, about a dozen different universities within the country. And so it extended from California through the Midwest, through the East Coast. That funding over time, over this period of 1948 to the late 1950s, resulted in this becoming a major enterprise. An enterprise that it was assumed would continue to be funded by the US government and by private foundations. But what turned out to be the case was that as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, gave way to the 1980s, the funding went up and down, and it really depended upon international events. It went down during détente, ironically, in the late 1960s and early 70s, and then increased after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then tapered off. And with the end of the Cold War, more funding was sent to other types of endeavors rather than the study of post-Soviet Russia. So the funding went up and down over time, but the existence at least 12 to 20 universities in the United States, and there were equivalent centers within, especially within England and Great Britain, was that this became an enterprise that was not going to stop. So you still have in the post-Soviet period major centers for the study of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia at the many universities that used to be beneficiaries of funding for the study of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Now, I entered the field in the mid-1960s. I started graduate school in 1966 at the University of Michigan. I was an undergraduate also at the University of Michigan, starting in 1962. And during my undergraduate years, I had a fascination with foreign language study. I took Spanish, I took Russian, I took German. But I got in 4 years of Russian language study at the University of Michigan, combined with one intensive summer at Middlebury College in Vermont, where we were pledged to speak only Russian with each other. And so I came into graduate school in 1966 already pretty proficient in Russian. I hate to use the word fluent. I became that after I visited the Soviet Union for 5 months as a stagiaire, as an exchange student. But I was pretty proficient in the language by the time I started graduate school, so I didn't have to do what a lot of students have to do when they enter graduate school and decide that they're going to study Russia, or back then the Soviet Union, and that is try to learn it through multiple intensive summer study as well as courses during their graduate career. And that was a major competing force on their time for those who had to learn Russian from scratch when they started graduate school. But the mid-1960s was also a time of growing turbulence in American society. And that led to turbulence also within the field of Soviet studies. A turbulence that led to a rejection of previous approaches to the study of the Soviet Union, and to, as we shall see, I think, an exaggerated effort to embrace an alternative approach to the study of the Soviet Union. Now, I assigned 3 readings to you. I realize that the intensity of this summer workshop is such that you may not have been able to read everything that was assigned. I found it breathtaking when I read the program and put myself in your place and realized how much reading you had to do, but also how many lectures you were going to be listening to. So the assigned readings that I gave you were my own reflections on the state of the intellectual history of the field. Starting in 1992 with my article in Defense of Sovietology, then in 1997 with my book chapter on counterfactual reasoning in the study of Soviet politics and foreign relations. And then many years later in 2013, my article, A Career in Soviet Studies, in which I tried to sum up the research agenda that I embraced, how I got into the field, and why I found it fascinating. What I didn't assign, because it would have been just too much, but what I would recommend to you if you find this session to be of interest and would like to go further, is a book that came out in 2009 by David Engerman called Know Your Enemy, The Rise and Fall of America's Soviet Experts. It is a very powerful book, and David Engerman, who's a professor at Brandeis University, has a very powerful mind. So let me summarize for you what my three articles were trying to do and why I tackled them. In Defense of Sovietology, you see it came out in 1992. So I worked on it in 1990 and 1991. And it was, of course, made all the more salient for me because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, why in defense of Sovietology? Well, at the time, there was widespread criticism of specialists on the Soviet Union for not having predicted the collapse of the USSR, the dissolution of the USSR, the collapse of Communist Party rule. That was based upon an assumption that the legitimacy of an area of study is governed by its ability to predict contingent events. And I thought that was sort of unfair because it assumed too much about the ability of scholarship to be predictive. Now, scholarship typically tries to be either descriptive or explanatory or evaluative, but does not try too often to get into prediction. But in the Soviet field, because so many Sovietologists were writing for public opinion audiences, for policymaker audiences, in addition to writing for their own academic reference group, they typically, especially those that studied Soviet foreign policy, would end their articles with something like implications for US foreign policy, or implications, in the case of British scholars, implications for Western policy toward the Soviet Union. And that became predictive. Now, from a methodological standpoint or a philosophy of science standpoint, you could say that explanation is based not only on looking at the sequence of events, but also on an implicit, if not explicit, theory that guides how you come up with an explanation based upon the research that you've conducted as to the sequence of those events. And if your theory is powerful, then it stands to reason that you would have predictive power instead of explanatory power, but only if the theory is able to predict the future. And that cannot account for the intervention of contingent events. And in the case of the USSR, it was Gorbachev. Very few people predicted that the way the Soviet Union would reform itself would be through a reformist coming up within the Communist Party who was willing to ultimately defy the leading role of the party. And so you could argue that on many counts, both his making it to the top and the evolution of his radicalizing policies, that Gorbachev was such a contingent event that you cannot be faulted for having not predicted it. But In Defense of Sovietology went far beyond that. I was very much interested in the literature of the 1950s that preceded the turbulence of the 1960s in Western societies, leading to the bifurcation of perspectives on the Soviet Union. The literature of the 1950s that came out of the Refugee Interview Project was massive. At least 5, maybe 6 books came out of it, in addition to a slew of dozens of articles. And they really gave us a glimpse into how the Soviet system worked from the bottom up, the societal. And what was very interesting was that despite this new insight into society and how the economy worked, internal to the factory, there's a book that came out of it called Factory and Manager in the Soviet Union, or in the USSR. These were wonderful studies based upon a newfound source of information. And those books might, have called the Soviet Union totalitarian, but what they were showing was the degree of diversity within the society, rather than simply documenting totalitarian controls and totalitarian violence. So In Defense of Sovietology was an effort to go back to the literature on the 50s and going forward to show the richness of the literature and the fact that its failure to predict the end of the Soviet Union should not be a permanent stain on the project that Sovietology was engaged in. Now, the second article came out 5 years later called Counterfactual Reasoning, and you know the full title from the reading. My colleague Philip Tetlock got in, a political psychologist, got into a project that he and Aaron Belkin launched on counterfactual reasoning in world politics. And they asked me to sign on to do a chapter on counterfactual reasoning in the study of the USSR. And I found it intriguing. I found that coming so soon after the Gorbachev revolution in the USSR and the dissolution of the country, this sensitized us to the role of contingency and personality in historical change. And that led directly into an interest in counterfactual reasoning. What if that contingency had not happened? What if that personality had not arisen? Now, I therefore wrote that chapter for that book, and it was simply one of those acts of intellectual curiosity that all academics engage in at some point in their career, even if it is not a part of an ongoing research agenda on their part, though I did do another article on counterfactual reasoning jointly with Ned Lebeau on the end of the Cold War, where, for example, we raised the counterfactual and then ran it through, asking, suppose Ligachev, not Gorbachev, had come to power in 1985, would there have been an end to the Cold War in the late 1980s? Would the Soviet Union have gone through a fundamental reform of both its internal and external affairs? And if the answer is, of course, well, very unlikely because of Ligachev's orientations, then you've got a powerful argument for contingency rather than a long string of explanatory factors being dominant in your explanation of what happened. And the career in Soviet studies, 16 years later, I was on the verge of retirement. I had published a lot of books and a lot of articles, and was approached by an individual, a scholar back east, who wanted to do a special issue of the journal Problems of Post-Communism on how specialists on the USSR adjusted to the post-Soviet realities in terms of continuing their research agenda. After all, I was in the middle of my career in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved, and I continued to be a productive researcher thereafter. Well, how did this affect my my research projects? And that's what a career in Soviet studies is about. I had fun writing it because it was an opportunity to think back on how I got into this field, and then a further opportunity to think back about how my research agenda evolved. And one of the ultimate themes is that had I entered the field after the end of the Soviet Union, I might not have entered the field because ethnography was not really something I felt comfortable doing or felt that I was very skilled at. And being a good ethnographer, you've got to have the temperament for it, you've got to have the passion for it, in addition to acquiring formal skills. And I just didn't think that I would do that very well. Textual analysis became really what I did most in my books and in my articles. Now, let me jump off from this introduction to how I got into the field and what I did with it to some lessons for those of you entering the field today. I mean, one question you're going to ask yourself is, if you haven't already done it, I assume most of you are at the stage of working on your doctoral dissertations, what constitutes a good dissertation topic? Why is it important? Am I simply entering a field of research that is a fad within my discipline currently? What is your foil? That is to say, whom are you criticizing? How are you seeking to differentiate yourself from what has gone before in the field? Because we would like to think that when we choose a dissertation topic, we're doing something that is important, that is not likely 10 years later to be looked back upon as simply a fad. And importantly, you want to make a new contribution to the field. Now, when you've had hundreds of other people who have previously been in this field publishing books and articles, you seek to make space for yourself by trying to criticize the past and demonstrate that what you're going to do is better. Now, you don't have to be doing that in an invidious way. It's not as if you're just being mean. That is part of the scholarly enterprise, criticism followed by improvement. But what this does do is tempt people to caricature what went before in order to criticize it unfairly, as it turns out, and then boast that yours is an improvement. Many a time in academia, in my department, I've been exposed to discussions of prospective new hires or discussions of doctoral dissertations in which a criticism has been that they've reinvented the wheel, meaning that somebody already did this before, but it was 30 years earlier, and they're ignoring the fact that it had been done before. So these are ways of situating your dissertation that you should be self-conscious about. A second thing you have to be self-conscious about, which all of you know already if you're at the stage, is what skill sets are required to do it well. Linguistic skill sets, but also research methodology skill sets. Are you going to be doing something that is highly quantitative, in which case you've got to come to terms with statistics and the like? Are you going to be doing something that requires you to be a good ethnographer on the ground? Are you going to be doing something that requires you to be a good textual analyst? Textual analysis is a reputable aspect of scholarship. What do you have to be good at? And what do you have to be passionate about? Without passion, you can't really do your project justice. Sitzfleisch, the German word for your ability to just sit and work endless numbers of hours. It means sitting flesh on your bottom is 50% of the battle. Without Sitzfleisch, it's hard to complete a dissertation, but it's not enough. You have to have both the skill sets and the passion, both for the topic and for the methodology, to be able to make your mark. But then you'll also be asking yourself, maybe before you started your dissertation, or while you're doing it, or only after you've made your mark with your dissertation, what do you imagine yourself becoming in the future? You know, I became an academic from the word go, and I never, well, at one point I asked myself whether I wanted to go into the Foreign Service, but during my graduate years I spoke to a professor who talked me out of that and said academia is the freest profession. Of course, there are constraints everywhere, but in government you've got to toe the party line to some extent, and in academia they actually pay you to say what you think after you have tenure, perhaps. So do you imagine yourself becoming an academic analyst, meaning an academic doing research and writing articles and books for the rest of your life? Or do you see yourself as becoming an actor in the, whether it's in government, in journalism, in politics, in the business sector, in NGOs, in international organizations, where you use your expertise on Russia or the other states of the FSU as someone who is acting upon that, scholarly knowledge in order to shape the way these organizations orient themselves, whether in a business way or in a governmental way or an international way, what have you. At some point, you're gonna want to ask yourself whether I want to be one or the other or a hybrid of the two. All of these are equally valid aspirations, but you have to know that your audience will be very different, that the role of discourse will be very different in the two realms, whether academia or others. That will lead you to have to acquire other kinds of skills, skills that may go beyond your dissertation research in order to have the kind of impact in these other realms that you might aspire to. Now, let me now speak to the issue of counterfactual reasoning, because there are any number of popular books that have come out over the decades on counterfactual reasoning, but not about the methodology of it in the sense of contributing to methodological thinking, but rather fun books that have come out, like, you know, what if Napoleon had not invaded Russia, that kind of thing. And then you try to run things through the history. And to many people, counterfactual discussions are just a parlor game. It's the kind of thing you do at the end of the day over drinks. It's fun. But I think that's selling it short. I think it's a useful exercise, whether done in writing or in speaking and interacting, a useful exercise in clarifying your assumptions or clarifying your claims about cause and effect. So for example, in the article that I did on counterfactual reasoning, I asked the question, would there have been a Bolshevik revolution in Russia had Russia not been a participant in World War I? Well, that gets to your implicit theories about the determinants of revolutions. And it gets also to your understanding of the degree of radicalization of Russian society in the years leading up to World War I. I personally believe that no, had there been no World War I or had Russia not participated in it, though that's somewhat fanciful because of the alliance structures at the time. But I believe that had Russia not participated in World War I, or if there had not been a World War I, there never would have been a Bolshevik revolution in Russia. Now, I would have to defend that on the basis of how I am going to clarify my assumptions about theories of revolution and my claims about cause and effect. Similarly, the question, was Stalinism a logical continuation of Leninism? Well, if Lenin had not died in 1924, but had died instead in 1936, I mean, he still would have been only in his mid-60s, would there have been a Stalinist experience in the USSR? That gets to your assumptions about how revolutions radicalize themselves. It gets to your assumptions about what Lenin stood for. It's a useful exercise. And similarly, would there have been an anti-Stalin campaign if Khrushchev had lost the power struggle in 1953 to 55? Or if he had just never been a member of the leadership? There you get into the extent to which other members of the leadership might have launched an anti-Stalin campaign of their own. I personally believe Khrushchev was a somewhat unique personality within that leadership, and that I can't identify anyone else within the leadership of 1956 in the USSR who would have launched an anti-Stalin campaign that was as far-reaching as Khrushchev's. Now, if you want to see a neat example of counterfactual reasoning of this immediate sort, immediate meaning looking at a few years and the causal sequence, Stephen Kotkin, who's now shortly to publish the third volume of his biography of Stalin. In his first volume, which came up to 1929 of Stalin's biography, he has a chapter called "What if Stalin had died?" What if Stalin had died in 1927? And he goes through each of the other members of the Politburo to analyze their personalities. And he ends up with the conclusion that Stalin was unique in having the personality that he had and the determination to not only to win, but to drive the country forward to the extent that he did. And it's a very convincing chapter to my mind. He said there would not have been a Stalinist revolution without Stalin. Gregory Grossman came up with a wonderful quip. Gregory Grossman is deceased, but he was we were colleagues together here for decades at Berkeley. He was a luminary in the field of Soviet economics. And he came up with the quip, if Stalin was not really necessary to build a powerful industrial civilization, if Stalin was not really necessary, would Bukharin have been sufficient? Well, that's a counterfactual question. And people have gone through the exercise of asking themselves if Bukharin had won the power struggle instead of Stalin and followed the evolutionary path to socialism that he was calling for, or to building what they called socialism, would the economy have looked a lot better 10 years later in the late 1930s than it looked under Stalin? They don't often get into the issue of whether the Soviet Union would have been prepared to fight Hitler better if Bukharin had won the power struggle than Stalin. So I don't view these as parlor games. I view these as clarifying exercises. Now, what I'd like to do now is speak to the issue of totalitarianism, to give you an example from the history of the field of a debate that I think turned into a distraction or a diversion. Totalitarianism was a term that arose within Mussolini's team, one of his intellectuals for fascist Italy in the 1920s, came up with the term to describe the total state, the state that would suppress civil society and run the show. So totalitarianism meant in the 1920s, it was not picked up much in Western scholarship, something very different from what it came to mean in the late 1940s. there emerged after the searing 20th century experience of Stalinism and of Hitlerism, a sense of both fascination.
Okay, I found this on the web for 20th century experience of Stalin. Is the end of Hitlerism off 8? Check it out.
Excuse me, please. My cell phone actually decided to speak to me on its own. That was Siri hearing something that I said about Mussolini, decided that she was going to look up Mussolini for me. But anyway, here I am, I'm back. It was a fascination among scholars in the late 40s about what this experience of Hitlerism and Stalinism taught us about history. And Hannah Arendt wrote a magnificent book, sprawling but magnificent book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And going beyond the origins of totalitarianism, led by Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski and other scholars, was an effort to capture what totalitarianism was, not just where it came from, why it came to be, but what it was. And what they ended up doing was coming up with a syndrome of what they called defining characteristics of totalitarianism, which were based on Hitlerism of the 1930s and early 40s, and based upon Stalinism from 1934 onward. And that syndrome of defining characteristics included mass terror and a despot at the top. Now that created a dilemma for these people, because in the post-Stalin era, while the command economy remained, while the ideology remained, what did not remain was the existence of a despot, meaning a despot who rules over his colleagues and uses mass terror to keep everyone in line. That disappeared in the post-Stalin era, and its disappearance, in a sense, was a defining characteristic of post-Stalinism. But now the syndrome, after all, a syndrome was supposed to be, here, 6 defining characteristics. The syndrome was no longer fulfilled, and that's where politics came in. Do you drop the term totalitarianism, or do you redefine it? Dropping the term came to be viewed as a political act. Keeping the term came to be viewed as a political act. That is, if you said that they're no longer totalitarian, you were in some sense apologizing for them. Or so it was in the political arena, which during the Cold War of the 50s and the 60s was very intense and heated. And so what came to pass in the 1960s, when you had the sort of the left of center reaction against the Vietnam War, against racial discrimination in American society, against subordination of women and so on, was that also within the Soviet field, the Sovietological field, you got people reacting against the totalitarian syndrome, not just to say that X, Y, and Z remain, but despotism and mass terror no longer exist, but there was a temptation to overdo it. And I think that's why I would call it a diversion on both sides, both those who stuck with totalitarianism and those who proposed alternatives, because the alternatives that were proposed were pluralism and interest group politics. Now, when you looked closely, you could always find a plurality of interests within the Soviet establishment, but that's not the same as pluralism. Pluralism is the allowance of civil society to self-organize in order to express its interests. That you did not have in the post-Stalin era. And people who, so Jerry Huff came up with the term institutional pluralism, which sounded to me more like what the literature on authoritarian regimes called corporatism. And Gordon Skilling called for the study of interest groups in Soviet society. Well, when civil society is not allowed to self-organize, it's hard to think of them as interest groups so much as perhaps institutional lobbyists within the establishment rather than within the broader civil society. But because politics was heated at the time, both during the Cold War and in the reaction against the Vietnam War and lack of civil rights in the United States, politics tended to polarize things. And what you tended to find was, over time, those who embraced an image of the Soviet Union as pluralizing through an interest group lens tended to predict stability, whereas those who argued for the continued relevance of the totalitarian model tended to predict that this cannot last. At some point, this has to fall apart. They never knew when that would be, and of course, in the end, as Lord Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. So if you don't specify how far in the future you're thinking about, it's not that that easy to swallow. But I think it would have helped the field greatly if, in the post-Stalin era, instead of sticking with the totalitarian label, it had gone back to Mussolini's definition of the term, where it did not require the degree of terror, despotism, and suppression of civil society that you found in the Stalinist era, but would have been entirely compatible with the constraints that continue to exist in the post-Stalin era. In fact, the syndrome no longer was fulfilled, but the term had such political resonance that it was hard to get rid of the term. Very few people tried to, except for East European dissidents. East European dissidents tended to go back to the Mussolini definition and say, this does characterize the post-Stalinist, Leninist systems that we're living with. And in fact, one East European dissident in Poland argued that what you had in Poland in the late 1970s, which led to solidarity, was what he called totalitarianism with its teeth kicked out. So what are the lessons for all of this before we turn to Q&A? What do you see as your identity as a specialist? How much time and energy do you want to devote to nominalist debates, meaning debates as to what label we should put on the phenomena we're studying? Everything needs to be named, but the nominalist debates, you've got to be very circumspect about the political load that any choice might have and how people might hijack it in the course of public discussion in ways that you neither intended nor wanted. How much time and energy do you want to devote to the political impact of your work, whether that's impact on public opinion or on political actors? And finally, how do you gain credibility as a scholar in the field or as a specialist who's not necessarily in academia? And how do you lose it? It takes you a long time to gain credibility. It does not take long to lose it. So you always have to be circumspect. And whose credibility are you seeking? Are you seeking credibility with the greatest scholars in your field? Or are you seeking credibility with a public audience? Are you seeking credibility with politicians? Do you want to be influential in the capital of your country, and so on? So these are questions to bear in mind. They're lessons from my own career. I spent my entire career at UC Berkeley. I've been here since 1971. It's been a marvelous experience, fabulous university, fabulous students, great place to raise kids, wonderful weather. So I have no complaints and nothing but thanks to good fortune. And I won't ask the counterfactual question, what would have become of me if I hadn't been hired by Berkeley?